Good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Sarpa. I'm the chairman of the Aspen Institute Community Forum, and we thank you for coming out on this beautiful bluebird day. Spring's coming a little early. We'll talk about what our traffic has to do with that maybe a little bit, but thank you for coming. Tonight, we have two wonderful experts that are going to be talking to us about transportation and mobility. I'm just going to give you a little background about what is this Institute Community Forum thing, and then my two colleagues here are going to speak for a few minutes. The Community Forum was formed in 1995 by the Institute to look at issues that really have an impact on our lifestyle here. And without going into it too much, over that 20-year plus period, the groups looked at things like affordable housing, communication technology, economic sustainability. Similar to those, recently the mayor of our town and some others came to the Institute and said, okay, traffic is a mess. Transportation is a mess. Mobility is a mess. Can you please, Institute, help us convene a group of people, our citizens, and bring in some experts from around our country and talk about this? What can we do? So that's really what this is all about. We've had one other public meeting. We're going to have some after this. This is being streamed live and it's being recorded. So if you want to watch it again, or if your friends couldn't be here tonight, they'll be able to see it. And we really want you to take advantage of this because our structure is pretty simple. We're a group that's asking the question, what should Aspen look like 20 years from now? Basically in the year 2035. What should Aspen look like in terms of our transportation and mobility? It's a very straightforward question. As everybody knows, this community has spent a lot of time, a lot of votes, and a lot of angst on the entrance to Aspen and money. My goodness, don't forget the money. Yeah, hundreds of thousands at the least, and millions probably on our transportation questions. So we're taking a little different approach. Our approach is, okay, can we come up with a shared vision for what our transportation and mobility should be looking like? And what are the values? What values reflect our community? And can we come up with those common values that should be used to kind of look at that transportation system? So we're looking for a vision and a set of values, that's our task force, that could be used by the government officials and by the community to say, you know what? That particular technical approach or that particular system works. It works for us in terms of our values and our vision. That's what we're trying to do. It's a very different approach, I might add. And we do look at technical things. We're going to talk about some very specific things. But that's the basic approach, if you will. And we're doing this in two ways. We have public meetings like this. We bring in some great experts. Please take advantage of this time and ask them any question you think is relevant to our discussion. And then tomorrow, after we've met with you and heard your questions, we have a group of about 30 people who have been selected by the Institute. They'll sit down with these people, and those 30 people, who are representative of our whole valley, I might add, will talk through their presentation and try to inform our vision, try to inform our set of values about what's going on. Now, we're not going to take a long time. That's another important part about this. We want this to be short in terms of what the Institute does. The Institute does not have a dog in this fight. They don't have a perspective. They're really only here to help us as a community to discuss it, providing us with these forums, the kind of live streaming and recordation that we've got going on tonight. So that's the process. We hope to be finished in a few months. We're kind of leaving that a little open, but not very long. We intend to bring this back to our community, bring the, if you will, the judgment of those 30 people and others and the Institute's input and what we think could be meaningful for our community for transportation and mobility. So the task force always has some chairmen. You've got to have chair people doing this. And we have two of those. Bill Kane, I'm going to introduce, and John Bennett will be introduced by Bill. These two gentlemen are the co-chair of the task force itself. I should thank the Institute. It's been very supportive. Zoe Brown is that lady over there, and Crystal Logan, who many of you know, are the kind of the brains and the help behind all this at the Institute level. And I want to thank two sponsors. This costs some money. We've got good sponsors. We have the Pitkin County, Snowmass, the City of Aspen, and the Aspen Institute, and a lot of private people contributing to this too. So thank you all for helping make this possible. I'm going to quickly introduce Bill Kane, Citizen Kane. I've been wanting to say that for a long time. Anyway, this guy was the head of the ski company's development office for years. He was a senior partner at Design Workshop. Throw in all kinds of boards. He's still on all kinds of boards. He was a manager in Basalt for a while, a city manager down there. He's done a lot. He's a really bright, well-informed, caring member of our community, and he's a wonderful co-chair along with John. I'll turn it over to Bill to say a few things about the task force.
Thanks, John. Thank you. Hi, everybody. If you notice, I'm walking tonight with a straight right leg. I'm really pleased to be here. I can tell you I'm extraordinarily pleased because 2 weeks ago I was in the operating room at Aspen Valley Hospital after a high-speed crash on straw pile. 45 years on Aspen Mountain without a scratch, and all of a sudden, good 1 minute and then surgery the next. It's the way it goes. But I just want to let you know I'm not trying out for a bit part in Young Frankenstein. It's just the way and I was, somebody reminded me during the Academy Awards that Gene Wilder reminded us that the pronunciation is actually Frankenstein. So with that, John also, thanks for that generous intro. I also served as city planner and Pitkin County planning director back in the 70s. The glaciers were just
really old.
Yeah, glaciers were retreating over Independence Pass, and the Ute Indians were migrating to Utah. So I just wanted to kind of set a little bit of context for Chris and Ann tonight and what they're going to talk about. So we've been at this for a little while. We have a forum of 30 individuals. These represent a cross-section of the community from every conceivable walk of life. And sort of the vision going into this was that we didn't want to resurrect yet another transportation planning conventional exercise where, we examine the mundanities of average daily traffic and demand and highway capacities and all the standard ingredients that might be included in a transportation plan. Our goal was to assemble a group of people to try to get up at a treetop level and start thinking really creatively about the transportation process in the valley in light of some fairly dramatic changes in demographics and in technology. Who had heard of Uber 4 years ago, and now kind of we are Uber. And so we have, through a series of really excellent speakers, we started with Jim Charlier 3 months ago, and Jim really brought us up to speed in terms of what's happening on the transportation planning front. We spent a fair amount of time looking at the future opportunities in autonomous vehicles, in the trunk line capacities, first and last mile analysis, and Jim really steered us into a really fascinating discussion about values. And we spent 2 full sessions discussing kind of a hierarchy of values, trying to figure out what transportation systems should do to deal with issues like safety, social equity, cost, and all of the criteria that should be applied to transportation planning. We then heard from Greg Rux at our last meeting. Greg is a transportation analyst for Rocky Mountain Institute, and Greg got us talking about some fascinating topics, mainly about platform-based ride sharing and possibly trying to harness the incredible investment in capacity and capital that resides in all the private vehicular transportation up and down the valley, and whether there aren't fresh ways of thinking about that and harnessing that in kind of a ride share or hail ride share kind of context. And so that's been pretty fascinating. And tonight we look forward to Ann and Chris and their take on it. They both have done significant work in the valley and know what we're about. But we just want to say a few words that kind of give you a context. This is not a cold start. We've been at this for a while. We've been through kind of the spade work of really discussing values and prioritizing things. And I think we've learned a lot about what's happening with fixed guideway transit, with rubber-tired systems, and with what's going on in the rideshare world. So with that, I'll introduce John Bennett. John needs no introduction, Mayor of Aspen. John, I think, led in a very creative manner many community discussions about transportation. It was slightly after my time. This was in '09, was this? Yeah. So we've all been at this for a long time, but we're very excited by this process, and we're hoping that we're going to bring some really fresh thoughts to the table. So,
thanks, Bill. We are really fortunate tonight, I think, to have two extremely interesting transportation engineers and planners with us. Both are with the firm of Fehr Peers, a transportation planning and engineering firm with offices in 15 cities across the nation. Fehr Peers has worked in literally thousands of cities, 42 states, and a dozen countries around the world. Ann Bowers is principal and project manager in Fehr Peers' Denver office. She has over 25 years of transportation engineering and planning experience, which clearly means she started in preschool. Her focus includes advanced state-of-the-art transportation analysis and working with clients to achieve sustainable transportation solutions that improve community living, community sustainability. Chris Breiland is a principal with Fehr Peers in Seattle. He's the firm's innovation leader, heading up its think tank and research and development efforts. He has a special interest in complex multimodal corridor analysis and balancing the diverse demands posed by a variety of overlapping mobility needs. And since we have both a complex multimodal corridor and a lot of overlapping needs, I think this will be well worth listening to, and again, extremely interesting. Please join me in a warm welcome for Ann and Chris.
All right. Is this on? Yes.
Yes.
For folks in the audience, I encourage you, we're going to be projecting some things on the screen. It's mostly there. We're going to be talking through some trends and some issues, but if you'd like to see some of the text, it's a little small, so I encourage you to move forward if you wanted to take a quick look. What Ann and I are going to be doing here to sort of start off the discussion is we're going to provide, again, it was said treetop level, some background about things that we have seen as transportation professionals changing in the last few years and what it means and what we've seen how other communities have adapted to those changes. And Ann in specific is going to talk a little bit of some of her expertise about how she's brought that to communities to bring forward solutions. And what we want to do is just keep this discussion at a high level and then hear from you. What are your concerns? I have to admit, as you heard, I'm from Seattle. I am a first-time Aspen visitor. I grew up in New Mexico, but never managed to wind my way into this part of the state. So this is a great opportunity for me to see your beautiful city and to learn a little bit more about some of the transportation challenges that you all face here. So let me kick this off here. And so go over a quick outline. These days in transportation, it's really exciting to be me, in my opinion, because transportation is changing in a way that we have not ever really seen before. It's more dynamic. I've been doing this not quite as long as Ann, but for about 13 years. It's a really dynamic picture out there, and this makes my job really interesting because as consultants, we work to advise communities about how to develop transportation plans and systems, again, 20, 30 years out in the future. Well, how do you do that when things change so much? That's what gets me excited every day, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of those change drivers today, and then what are other cities doing, as I already noted. So let's start with what is changing. So this graph, it's impossible to read the numbers or text. What it says is that in history, this is a, quote, fact that the Department of Energy had listed in some of its documentation back in the early 2000s. The fact was that there's this relationship between vehicle miles of travel and gross domestic product. They're tied together. As one goes up, so does the other. And you could see this was baked in since the 50s that they moved in lockstep with one another. Well, something happened recently And that fact doesn't hold true anymore. Something changed. In 2004, 2005, depends where you are, I have some slides on this, the two decoupled from one another. How much people drive in their private vehicles cumulatively across the country is no longer married to gross domestic product. And you'll note that this happened before, a lot of people say, oh, that's an effect of the Great Recession. This happened before the Great Recession took place, and it's now just starting to come back. And the question that we as planners and engineers are faced with, what's that line going to do in the future? Is it going to go back up? Is it going to stay flat? Is it going to wiggle around and then go down? And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But just some notes on VMT. So VMT peaked differently in different states, no surprise there. I just pulled out this data from University of Connecticut on Colorado, where the VMT peak was in 2005 here. And I also dug up what happened in my now home state of Washington, where the VMT peak was back in 1992. So quite a while back, and there's been a lot of change in Washington. Washington and Colorado, besides various agricultural products, have a lot of similarities in terms of economy and growth, and both states see a lot of change. But Washington saw its VMT peak back in 1992 per capita. What does this mean? What's going on here? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the why. And again, I'm going to keep it at a high level. I encourage you to ask me about these questions, because I could spend an hour talking about each one of these little bubbles if you want me to, but nobody wants to hear me talking that long. But these are some of the whys that we as a firm, Fehr Peers, have explored. We, as was mentioned, have a research and development group. I lead one of our groups called FP Think, and we have developed some trends and analyses to look at why might this be changing. And these were some of the bubbles that we had a couple of years ago, and we've added 3 or 4 bubbles since then, because again, things are changing really quickly. I'm going to just talk about a few of these bubbles here, but I encourage you to ask about any of them if you're curious about what's going on. So one of the things that's shown up there on the left is labor force participation rate. This is how many people are actively working in the economy. And you can see that that number peaked back in the early 2000s as well. So it used to be with more women entering the workforce, that number of people who was actively out there working, commuting, was going up year after year. And then it hit a plateau, and it's been going down since then. And there's a whole bunch of reasons about that. And if you pick up any business section of a newspaper, you're going to read a little bit about that. But that's an important factor, in our opinion, as to what's behind this. Another factor that's been pushing down that VMT is shown there on the right. This is the sort of driver's license rates by different age groups tracking back to the 70s, and everyone says millennials are different. Well, millennials, I think, get overly bundled into a simplified group, but needless to say, younger people are getting licensed for vehicle driving at a much lower rate than they were in the past. It peaked in the 70s, and it had been going up for a long time before that. And we have some reasons why we think that's the case that I'll talk about in just a minute. The other thing that's changed a lot is sort of this on-demand everything these days. And so we have the rise of a lot of these services that can supplant need to go out and shop. We don't know exactly what the effective vehicle miles travel are from these services. If you don't shop at the store, you're not driving there. But if you shop a lot more on Amazon and you're a Prime member and you get something delivered to your house every 2 days and you have the UPS guy going back and forth, that might generate more trips. But needless to say, UPS is far more efficient at driving around than you are. It's their business. So we're not quite sure what the future holds for these, but they are affecting not just the retail industry, but the whole travel sector and freight sector as well, and that's definitely borne out in some of the data that we've been tracking. One other mention I'd like to put in here is something that might be more relevant for a community like Aspen. It's everywhere, but in certain communities we see this more pronounced, is there's an aging population. The baby boomers are moving into the over 65 cohort, and baby boomers, just like millennials, are quite different than their previous generations. And you can see the licensing rate for baby boomers is much higher than it was for the previous generations in that group. And not only do they have more licenses and are driving, more licenses to drive, they're driving a lot more. So this is pushing that trend of VMT in a different direction, particularly in different cities across the country. And those are all these trends that are pushing back and forth that we've been seeing affecting VMT, and why it has, a lot of those used to all point in the same direction, and now they have disjointed from each other a little bit, and that's why we're seeing this change in VMT. And the question for us as planners and engineers is, again, what's the likelihood of that going in one direction or another in the future? The next piece I want to talk about are some of the bubbles that we didn't really have on that chart when we were playing around with this a few years ago, and that's what I call technology-enabled transportation choice. So it's really sort of the ability for people to sort of on demand start to look at transportation as a service. Transportation used to be a means to get you somewhere. You were privately, generally responsible for having your own vehicle. You could take public transit, which works well in really dense urban areas, not as well in some other areas, but it was really kind of pushed onto the private sector and individuals to do. Not so much anymore, and this, while is starting in urban areas, it's spreading like, wildfire to all over the place, and the companies that are behind this are bent on making this ubiquitous. Again, it's their business. So the rise of the sharing economy is part of this, and because you have technology that connects you to everybody, you can share everything now. Car share, bike share, and these ride shares are what are called transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft. They don't do the cute little mustache anymore, but these are these ride-hailing services that you can just pick up on your iPhone or whatever, and they'll be there in 2 minutes, and you can go wherever you want. They have everything on sharing. They have tool share these days because, again, you can connect. I don't know if they're going to do things like shoe share, because that's kind of gross, but so there's limits to this, but the point being that the ability for people to connect makes the ability to sort of pool resources, and that's changed things a lot in the transportation world. So with that comes something that we see helps to push some transportation trends down. It's much more transparent how much it costs to make a trip under these services. If you own a car, you bought the car for $30,000 and it's sitting in your garage, you pay insurance once a year, whatever, and when you go and take a trip, you're not feeding a meter to get that car to work. If you take Uber or if a taxi, if you'd still do that, you literally see the cost ticking up, and it's much more transparent what that cost of that trip is because you're paying for it right then and there. And that is a price signal that people are responding to. So people in urban areas who are doing this tend to see that cost more and tend to travel a little bit less. There's this other trend that I think gets back to why do the younger generations not license as much, and this is something that I deal with when I look at travel modeling. I develop a lot of travel models, but it's this increasing value of in-auto time, and that sounds very technical, but what it really means is that the time for you to be in the car is more valuable to you than it used to be because you would rather be Snapchatting or reading a book on your tablet or whatever than driving. You don't want to drive, it's a pain in the neck. So that's why things like transit and TNCs have risen in popularity because it's just much more convenient if you don't have to deal with the hassle of driving. And when we look forward towards the future of where some of these services are going, we'll see some of those trends and how they might bear out in just a minute. So just some data on TNCs. Again, these are the Ubers and Lyfts of the world. So APTA, which is the public transit sort of consortium, all the public transit agencies, and a think tank, did some data, and people who use ride-share services tend to drive less, use transit more, and a lot of them have postponed the purchase of a car or sold their car. And I would say the trend of families with one car rather than two is actually probably a little bit more striking and interesting to me than the car-free people. Yeah, there's going to be some car-free people, but what if people don't buy as many cars? That's something that's going to change people's travel choices, and quite honestly, car companies know about this and are concerned about that. Weekends saw the most use of ride sourcing. When you look at Uber and Lyft data, weekends, evenings are their biggest times. It's more for social travel than for a lot of pieces, but again, that has effects on how people travel. On another hand, researchers from UC Berkeley looked at shared mobility users, and they found, well, where are they taking the travel away from? If you're taking an Uber, what aren't you taking anymore? And not surprisingly, taxi. This was done in the Bay Area, California. Taxis are losing mode share. There's drive a car at 6%. But the thing that strikes me as interesting is transit. Transit's the second largest loser, so to speak, in this case, second to taxi. And we all know taxis are shifting because of this. Transit was the second largest loser. So what does this mean? These tell two different stories, and they're two reputable sources doing these data. I can cop out and say it's too early to tell what's going to happen, but the point being that when we have looked, Fehr Peers has looked at these sorts of changes, and we roll on what's next, what's in the future. These are just that's the Google self-driving car. These are an image from FHWA, which is the U.S. Federal Highway Administration, about connected vehicles. This idea of autonomous vehicles is coming. It's going to be coming faster than a lot of people thought just a few years ago. What does that mean when you connect all these pieces? Who are some of the big drivers behind autonomous vehicles? It's the Ubers, it's the folks like Apple and Google, and it's the car companies, because they see that, well, if people aren't going to buy cars as much anymore, let's make sure that we're not being dinosaurs and we're riding the wave of these autonomous fleets. When we've done some look at what these autonomous fleets could look like for travel, that VMT line starts to make a remarkable difference, because if you had an Uber with an autonomous operator, meaning you don't have to pay that driver anymore, and I'm not going to get into the whole economy about driving and what that means for equity and whatnot, but that cost of that trip went down by 40% to not have the driver in there. So what does that mean for public transit? What does that mean for walking? If it's so easy just to hop in this car that magically shows up when you think about it, and it can take you wherever you want, what does that mean? It means, from our research, a lot more driving, and that needs to be managed. And that's one of the lessons that we think is really important for cities as they move forward, is that you need to watch out for this trend, because if you think congestion coming into town is bad now, what happens if you have your self-driving car and you say, I don't want to park it here, I'm just going to send it home. And it can drive itself home. Or, hey, I need it to pick up some stuff. I'm just going to send it to go run errands for me, and people just throw junk in it, and it goes and there's nothing that says that you can't do that. How do we manage that situation is something that we as planners are thinking about, and I encourage you all to think about, what does that mean for Aspen? So with that, I just wanted to throw some provocative ideas out there, and feel free to ask me questions about that. But I wanted to turn over to Anne to talk about how some communities are taking advantage of people's sort of propensity to change a little bit more, and her work working with Aspen and other places.
Thank you, Chris. Is this on? Another important thing I think about the autonomous vehicles is that these TNCs, Ubers and Lyft, they're pushing it, again, Chris said, really fast. And the reason is they're not making any money right now. And it's because the labor costs are so high. So they're looking to get rid of that cost so they start making money. So anyway, so what are other communities doing? Chris talked a lot about the technology and the impacts that has. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But a little bit more about the behavioral aspect. What can we do to change people's travel behaviors? So this is, how many have heard of transportation demand management, or TDM? Show of hands. Okay, good. For those that haven't, I'll go into a little bit of what that means, but transportation demand management is basically managing transportation demand, obviously. It speaks for itself. So everybody wants to drive freely. Nobody wants to be stuck in congestion. But so does everybody else on the road. And everybody wants somebody else to change their behavior. They don't want to be the one to do it. And so what we need to do is manage travel. And how can we do that? There's ways to do it through managing the roadway and the infrastructure systems, and how we plan our land use, and how we plan for transit and pedestrian and bicycles. But there's also a lot of behavior challenges. And TDM can be seen as, there's some strategies that are carrots, there's other strategies that are sticks. And so you need to look at your values and determine whether or not you're comfortable with the carrots and the sticks. So again, what is TDM? It's just a range of strategies, so how we operate our roadways and how we try to influence people's behavior and how they travel. What choice of travel are they choosing, and how do we incentivize them to do travel other than riding in their car by themselves, single occupant vehicles. So TDM has a lot of different aspects, and it's based on land use and neighborhood enhancements. That can be things like density, diversity, so the density of your developments and how much housing, say, per square mile. The diversity of land uses. If you have a mixed-use development where you're providing for different services for people, you don't just have your 5-story multifamily apartment house anymore, but you have the apartment with the office and the retail uses within either that building or within that community, that helps reduce the amount of auto travel because you're providing people those services within walking distance or biking distance. Parking management and pricing, not a very popular topic, but really when you start managing your pricing of your parking, if you drive on I-70, if you want to drive in the fast lane, you pay more. If you want to park during peak times, you pay more. And it's also, when we, in Denver, a real popular thing right now is when people come and they want to develop a residential multifamily development. Has anybody heard of the Rhino area? It's called River North. It's Brighton Boulevard. Used to be industrial, scary place to go when I was growing up in Denver. Now it is the hot place. So they're trying to accommodate all these millennials and whatnot that want to live there, and they're building apartments like crazy. But the city has yet to catch up. Their policies are still saying, well, our minimum parking requirement is this. You must build this minimum parking. We'll talk more about parking, but a lot of cities have gone to maximum or no parking. Why are we providing all this parking? It just encourages people to have a car and park it. But what's important is you have to have an entire parking management system. You can't just do one piece of a parking strategy and not the entire system. And we can talk more about specifics on that. Making sure that your transit, pedestrian, and bicycle system is inviting to people. You've probably heard the term first and final mile. So people maybe take the bus or Velociraptor, but how do they get to that and back? Is it difficult for them to walk or bike, or is it not comfortable or inviting at all? So making sure that all modes have the same infrastructure and enhancements that we provide for vehicles. Commute trip reduction programs. This is really based on focused on employers, and those programs, those strategies within employer incentives are shown to be the most effective. And so that are things like providing employees free or subsidized transit passes, providing car shares at the site. So if an emergency comes up, they have a car that if they need to get to their child's school or something. Giving employees cash for what that company would have paid for them to park on site. So it's called cash out parking. And a lot of employees would rather have that cash in their pocket than the company paying for them to have a parking stall. So a lot of things that are aimed at employers, they're actually relatively inexpensive to implement. Our office in Denver, we provide free eco passes to all the employees. We have one parking stall for the entire office, and it's rarely used. And it's just if there's a long trip that needs to be made, it's there for that person. But everybody else takes transit or walks or bikes to work because we've provided that. We also provide commuter incentives. So we give them, what is it, Chris, about $200 we give them to repair their bike or buy a new seat or something for their bike. So we're encouraging them to take other modes. And then marketing and incentives. That can be as simple as having real-time transit, Uber, Lyft information in the lobby of a building, in the lobby of a hotel, in the lobby of an apartment complex, telling people when, real time, when is the next bus coming, or when is the light rail coming, how far away is the closest Uber or Lyft driver. All these things help, and then just marketing. When we worked on the Aspen TDM project, we worked a lot because of the resort aspect here. Marketing was a big piece within those resorts to get the visitors to utilize other modes of transportation than hopping in a car. So what's new? Chris and I were talking on the way up here that whatever we say today is going to change in 3 weeks. So if you're going to watch this, watch it quickly because it'll change. But it's ever changing and evolving. As Chris said, it's a very exciting time to be in transportation. It's very challenging because we don't have all the answers because things are changing so quickly. We have some ideas, and that's hopefully what we can help you with. But what's new at TDM, when the Aspen TDM project was implemented, we didn't have the public-private mobility partnerships. We didn't have, we had no idea the impact that Lyft and Uber might have on people's travel choices. I talked probably a little too much on the market-based pricing, but that's becoming really important, where again I said communities now are going to maximum or no parking. I just saw a video in Jersey City where they require new developments to not have any parking with their developments. And so what they've done, though, they've invested in other modes of transportation. Parking, again, just peak disincentives. Again, that's an entire management system. You have to enforce it. And then I talked about the TNC and the autonomous vehicles. We are engaging in a study right now in the UC Berkeley area where they're striving to have zero carbon buildings. So and one of the aspects of that is they want us to look at all the transportation. What can transportation do to help them build basically a zero carbon footprint on any new building, and they're also looking at retrofitting some of the old buildings. So how does transportation play into that? All the autonomous vehicles and the TNCs and changes in parking and management are playing into that. So we're actually gathering data now on the impacts and what that has, how that can help reduce VMT. All the other methodologies and the ones that were proposed here in Aspen, we have tons of research on how they help reduce travel. Some of these are so new we don't have it, but we're starting to gather that data, and hopefully we'll have good information soon. And then trip caps. You have somewhat of a trip cap here, I think, in your Aspen community plan. The value was not to increase the amount of traffic coming over the bridge, and so far you have done that, which is admirable. A lot of cities are putting a trip cap on a particular development, saying this is all you're going to be allowed to add to our system. You're responsible to figure out how you take care of the rest through its TDM or other programs. A recent Peer City example, we did a TDM plan for Park City. Similar to Aspen, but different in ways too. But I think what's different about this one is a lot of times when we do TDM plans, we do a blanket and we recommend or implement most of the strategies. It's land use, transit, employer incentives. What we did in Park City was a little different, is we actually started with a survey to find out where we could have the most impact. It doesn't make sense to put in a strategy when people aren't going to utilize it, they're not interested in it, it's not going to have any impact. And what we found there was the greatest impact was not on visitors and tourists. We could get a small reduction in that, but not really substantial, nothing really to even notice. It was the employers within Park City that could have the largest impact. And not surprisingly, it was great that they were the ones that are most interested in providing strategies and incentives or disincentives in some case to their employees. So this program was a little bit different in that we didn't apply a lot of the typical strategies that we did. We focused it on where we saw people said they were most interested, and we saw the most impact. So again, on the theme of what's going on in other areas, as Chris talked about, the Ubers and the Lyft and what the difference and what is the impact on transit. We just are wrapping up a study right now in the city of Centennial. It's a suburb south of Denver. The city received a Bloomberg grant, and they partnered with Lyft to analyze what it would take to provide people that first and final access to one particular transit station on the light rail system. And currently, RTD has a call and ride system. So you could call up and say, I need a ride to the station, and they would come around and take you. We, again, the city partnered with Lyft and Xerox at the time. Xerox developed an app called the Go Denver app. And basically, you could look at that app, you tell them where you want to go, and the Lyft driver could be there in however many minutes it tells you that it could be there. What was really important about this one, it was the first program in the nation, it was fully subsidized. So people didn't pay anything for that service. Again, they had a Bloomberg grant, which helped, but the city helped subsidize. It was demand responsive, which was what Chris was talking about. People want that, and we all want what we want it now anymore. It also provided wheelchair accessible transportation. So currently, that call and ride system has a current subsidy of $21. And so that Go Centennial project served 3 to 5 riders for the cost of every one of those call and rides. So it's really, they're changing the dynamic of how we get to and fro, to put it mildly. So a little bit, we'll wrap up here with some trends. TDM is expanding into large and small cities. We're embarking on a pilot project for the city and county of Denver. It's a big city. They have no formal TDM program whatsoever right now. They are trying to implement it as development comes in, as particularly in this Rhino development, but they don't have a policy in place. They cannot force people to do this. So the city ultimately wants to do a citywide program, but they want to start with a small pilot program. So it's exciting, and I think people see the benefit of that. Again, the concerns about the TNCs, the impacts on traffic, equity, curb space, and transit ridership. Chris talked about the mode that's hurt the most is transit. The future of autonomous vehicles, whether it's in freight, fleets, and the regulations of that. How do we manage all that? How do we build for that? The infrastructure has to change. And then wait and see, the pilot versus the test. A lot of these pilot programs, before people go into full-blown projects. So I think those are some of the trends. I think I do want to say one last thing. I think because things are changing so quickly, and the public is more vocal nowadays than they have been a long time about how their tax dollars are spent. And agencies are really under scrutiny about how they spend money. And so the agencies have to be real careful about these large infrastructure projects that are being proposed. One example is if you've ever flown into the Oakland airport and wanted to take BART, in the past, there wasn't BART didn't come all the way to the Oakland airport. You had to take a bus that would take you to the Coliseum, which was the first BART stop, and then hop on there. Well, they recently just built Air BART, it's called. So Air BART connects you now directly from the airport to the Coliseum station where you can hop on BART. $486 million they spent on that project. The ridership is so low. It's embarrassing, and the agency is taking a lot of heat for spending that kind of money, because Chris and I were talking about the reason is the cost to take that is so high that it's a lot less expensive for people to call Uber or Lyft and get to the first BART stop than it is for them to take this massive project that they undertook. So it's a little soapboxy, but I think it's just important to really look at how we spend our dollars, and the public has a lot of influence on that. So I think Chris and I will stop talking. I think we're open to questions now.
All right. I think is this on? We're gonna take a few minutes and have questions up here, but let's thank them first just for the presentation. So I have a few questions we'll go over, and we'll spend 15 or 20 minutes maximum, because we want you to have the opportunity to ask your questions. So it'll be 15 or 20 minutes. We'll have a little discussion up here, and then we'll open it up to you for the last half hour or so. So, we've done a lot in this community, as you are both well aware. We have RAFTA system that has almost 5 million riders a year. We've got 20 years of paid parking, HOV lanes, bike paths. I mean, we've got a lot going on here. We have 2,800 affordable units, roughly. So we've tried to build housing near our main line so that people don't have to get in their car and go someplace. And yet we have a mess. And we even have a cap. You mentioned the cap. But guess what? Even with the cap, we still have horrible traffic. I mean, that's why we're here, or one of the main reasons we're here. So it's a pretty straightforward question. Knowing all that you know, if you were in our shoes as a community, where would you focus your efforts? What would you kind of take on first? And even though it's changing so fast, pick something. I'll ask both of you to pick something to focus on. And is this solvable? I mean, is this little community of 6,000 people now that goes up to 40 or 50,000 with one road in and one road out, all these things, what's your impression of our ability to make a real dent on our traffic?
So, yeah, I guess I'll give that a shot to start with. So the one thing that I talked to a lot of communities about traffic congestion, and one thing that I like people to kind of take into perspective, because the question of is this solvable and what would you focus on first, I want to kind of split those up a little bit. The is it solvable question, lots of communities have solved the traffic congestion problem. These are some communities that you might be aware of, places like Buffalo, New York, Erie, Pennsylvania, Detroit, Michigan. Lots of those areas don't have traffic congestion a lot anymore. What happened to those places? They're places that nobody wants to be anymore. So so traffic congestion from a transportation planner's perspective, if you had a wide open road that nobody was on, I tell you, wasted a lot of money on a road that not a lot of use is getting out of it. So congestion, I think, in a lot of people's minds needs to be kind of reframed. Congestion is vitality. Congestion is economic activity. Congestion is a fun place to be. Now, you can have too much of a good thing, if congestion could be called that. So it has to be managed. But so I think the issue of can you solve the problem needs to be reframed as to what amount of congestion is acceptable for our community. Because if you get rid of it all, then you likely don't have most of the community that you like in the first place. So I think that's an important perspective for folks to take. But in terms of how can you manage that level so that it doesn't get untenable, so you're not turning away businesses because people don't want to work or invest here, or people can't live here so they move away. Some of the things that I think Jim Charlier mentioned are, it's important to provide feasible, meaningful transportation options. And I think the Valley here has done a lot. Just again, first time through here, there's a lot of things that a lot of communities that I work in sort of kind of rural Washington would be really interested and love to have that you guys have undertaken. But that sort of just providing the facilities isn't necessarily good enough. It's also to make sure that people understand that there are choices, that if you don't want to sit in congestion, what's a viable option, and to make sure that that congestion impact that they are feeling and that they're imposing upon other people, that that is something that is taken value, that's a valuable space that's being taken up. And I think providing options and how do you help pay for that is part and parcel with the ability to make sure that the amount of infrastructure that we have available, that we're valuing it appropriately. And there's a whole bunch of equity questions that I think are worth discussing, but sort of how do you manage through price signals that you can then reinvest in improving that the variety of modes so that people have options, because not everybody can walk, not everybody can drive. You need to have options out there.
Yeah, I think just to, you covered it well, Chris, but I think, you know, the options is important, and to make sure that, not that you have options, but they are given equal weight and attention as what we seem to invest in options for the vehicle. And I think, you know, even terminology in our business is changing. We used to talk about, you know, moving cars. Now we talk about moving people. And that first graphic I had up there about, you know, everybody wants to drive by themselves and they don't want to sit in congestion. We've even started using the term seat utilization. How many seats in a car do you see empty as you're sitting in that traffic? There's a lot of empty seats there. And so really, I think the options, and there isn't one, you know, golden bullet that will solve everything, but moving as many people as possible. And again, though, I think whatever you invest in, it needs to be able to adapt. So if you're spending multi-million dollars on infrastructure, that might only be valid and valuable for 10 or 15 years, that's hard to swallow. So maybe the infrastructure is put in so that it can be repurposed at some point. Maybe you don't spend hundreds of thousands of dollars at each platform station. Maybe they're temporary per se, knowing full well that things might change. So it's it's a lot of shift, and I think just a combination of a lot of things.
So we're not probably going to spend several $100 million in this community on fixing our transportation mobility. I'm just guessing. Some people may say that's exactly what we need, but let's assume for a moment it's not a big investment like that, and we won't hopefully make the same kind of mistake that you've just shared with us in the Bay Area. So let's talk about ride sharing. Do you think ride sharing and more efficient use of the platforms, as we call them, is possible in our little community? And is that applicable in a small community? Because, of course, we know volume has something to do with that efficiency of that ride sharing platform. So, again, yeah, when we get busy, there's 40 or 50,000 of us running around here, but a lot of the year there's 4 or 5, 6,000 maybe here. So talk a little bit on the viability of this sharing concept in our valley.
Want me to start? Okay, I'll give that a start. So I think you're right. Right now, and again, complete neophyte here. Is there Uber or Lyft here operating today?
Very little bit. Yeah, 3 drivers maybe. That's Uber, I think. 4, excuse me. We have a downtowner, so we have some ride sharing.
Okay.
And 4 Uber guys and ladies.
Fair enough. And I'm actually surprised that Uber and Lyft haven't quite gotten this far yet in terms of, it's a density question, and that's a valid point. So the sort of the double-edged sword of that density question is how quickly are they able to drive their costs down to be able to provide that, because I think there is a strong viability for this sort of pooled fleet of vehicles that, again, imagine it's transportation as a service. What if you could get a subscription and say, I'm going to pay $200 a month for whatever vehicle, mobility needs that I need. And it has likely, think of, and I hate to use this analogy because everybody hates them, but it's like the cable companies. It's you pick the bundle that you need, and they will provide that service. And for a lot of people, it will be less expensive than owning their own vehicle. You say that the Valley won't necessarily spend hundreds of millions of dollars on fixing the transportation issue, but I can tell you the Valley will spend hundreds of millions of dollars on transportation because you're already doing it. Every time somebody buys a car, they're paying, a not insubstantial amount of money. So I think there's definitely a solution for that, but we have to wait for the technology to catch up to that. But are there other options that people can use in a shared sense? In certain areas, a bike share and other things can be a pretty well thought solution. Here you got challenges like big piles of snow on the side of the road and whatnot, but certainly in the summer when I know your peak is, that's an option. Those are particularly popular for tourists. So again, there is no one solution. I think these different solutions provide options, and in the right conditions, the TNCs and sort of the fleets they operate have been shown to reduce vehicle use. So I think that's definitely an option.
Ann?
Yeah, and I think, again, I don't mean to keep harping on the management piece of it, but it's an entire system and everything needs to be managed together because I remember specifically when we worked on the plan here, one of the concerns that city staff has was, these resorts will come in and they said, we'll take care of, our TDM solution is we're going to run a shuttle. And so every single resort had a shuttle and they were driving around the city. That wasn't really solving the problem, but that was an easy check the box solution for the resort to do. So that was really the reason for the whole TDM implementation, is that they could have a little more teeth in being able to tell development what to do. But again, it's managing all that, managing all the options and making sure that the ride share and everything, and as we go into autonomous vehicles, what's concerning and what the trends are showing now is that generates more travel. And so how do we manage that? Some city, I can't remember what cities in California are saying that, well, if we're going to have that, if we're going to have car share or something, so many people have to share that same car. We can't have every person having their own, the car to share amongst their family. That it's almost being mandated that has to, every seat in that car has to be shared with somebody else.
Talk about the stick. You talk carrot and stick because we're a community that just shies away from sticks. We're very independent-minded here, and I seem to hear you say there's quite a few of the disincentives and the sticks out there. Talk a little bit about the relationship to disincentives and ride sharing, if you will, and what you see the connection there, if any.
Well, I think, one that I talked about is no parking. I mean, when it's a disincentive to a developer and their lender. So the problem we're facing now is, I will answer your question. It's policy questions. So now we have cities saying you must have these many parking stalls per dwelling unit that you have. This is a minimum. And so in the past, developers will, great, the minimum's 2, I'm going to build 4. And now, even today, lenders are saying, I'm not going to provide funding for this project because you're not parking it high enough. So we have to change that mind shift. And I think where the stick comes in is where cities saying, no, this is our policy. So putting that maximum on it, and you just start changing people. Also, pricing, pricing it so that it's very uncomfortable to park downtown at peak times. People might just decide that they're going to change how they get downtown to go out to dinner. And then, the parking pricing's a big one. Disincentives on the employer side are, again, not providing any parking for employees. And Chris and I were talking about a development today. Is it in Seattle?
Yeah, the one
Yeah.
that we were talking about. And I think one piece of context is that this is sort of somewhat hyperbole to say, no parking. We're not going to go to a situation with no parking, and certainly not any time in the near future. But one thing that I'm working on with the city of Seattle is sort of how do you rationally tie a policy goal that says, if the city is to grow, which that's their intent, and they want to maintain a reasonable amount of congestion, and a reasonable amount of congestion in Seattle might be unacceptable to somebody else. But for the Seattleites, that's a reasonable amount of congestion. They need to make sure that there's a limited amount of vehicle trip growth. Thus, they're tying their parking policy to say that we can't, if we're trying to control how much vehicle trips there are, we need to control how much parking spaces are available, because you can't talk out of one side of your mouth and say we want to limit how many vehicle trips we have, but at the same point have abundant and easy parking. It doesn't work together. So they're coming up with parking maximums that are tied to how much congestion they can tolerate. And in a built-out city, you cannot keep building roads. There's only so much space to accommodate that, unless you're going to start to take down people's buildings or whatnot, or build over parks. Nobody wants to do that. So that's that policy to start to push that down, and there's a policy nexus and a sort of an outcome nexus to make sure that people are saying, here's how much congestion we're willing to tolerate. Well, we need to sort of all own up to that and have fewer vehicles parking. And the trends are already there anyway. This is not terribly controversial right now, because we worked with the community. On average, if you go at night, 40% of all the parking spaces in apartment buildings in the city of Seattle are empty, because people don't own as many cars as they used to. And if you go to office buildings, you get a similar pattern. So we're not forcing things that are completely unpalatable for folks. We are incrementally moving the dial, because that's what needs to happen to make sure that that city is viable and functional, so that if somebody needs to drive because it's something of a very high value and that car is the best way to do it, there's some space to do it as opposed to just gridlock. That's the ultimate goal.
Okay, last question, then we're going to turn it back to the audience, so be thinking of your questions. We've talked about value-based transportation. I want you both to share with us, have you seen that in other communities? Has that been a helpful approach? In other words, coming up with your core values, and then when you start to look at things, whether it's a platform or disincentives, you look at those different systems through those values, and it's the values and the vision become your touchstone. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and what you're seeing in other communities, and whether or not you think that would be helpful here?
Sure. So I'll start, and I'll give two examples, because I want to give two kind of different examples. One city is the city of Kirkland in Washington, and they are a community on the lake. They're completely built out, and yet they are increasing the amount of growth in terms of accommodating more people, more affordable housing, more market rate housing. Their values that they set out when we updated their comprehensive plan was that they wanted a vibrant downtown, and for people to be able to access that downtown. Downtown's only got a handful of roads in it. Most of them are 2-lane roads. Because the value is that they wanted to have access to the downtown and they wanted more growth downtown, we had to jettison a long-standing policy of level of service, which is an engineering term. They threw away their traffic level of service policy. So we're not going to have a traffic level of service policy, because we can't have that if we're trying to accommodate bus lanes, because we need to get more people in here. Bus lanes, adding bike lanes on streets. If we're holding to traffic level of service, that will dominate everything, and we won't be able to grow the way that we want to. That was their vision, was growth in a sustainable way, and the policy outcome was to not focus on traffic level of service. The counterpoint to that is a community of Spokane Valley, which is on the east side of the state, where we did a visioning workshop with them, very clearly stated that they moved there because it was easy to move around. It wasn't Spokane, which is sort of the core urban city. They like to be able to just freely be able to drive where they need to. okay, I'm not the decision maker. I don't pass judgment upon what people want to do, but there's implications for that. But they clearly stated what their visions are. So that vision, it translates to, well, we have to watch out how much density we can accommodate, and we're going to have some road widening projects that are going to take out rows of businesses to maintain their level of service standard. They might change that in the future when they see how much that costs and how many people are displaced or moved, but vision setting works, and both of those communities embraced their community plan update because they generated it. So I think it's fundamental in many respects to what we do.
Okay, thank you. Ann?
I think tying into the level of service piece, so as Chris said, that's a terminology that traffic engineers have used to how much congestion is on the roadways for the vehicles. And the state of California, it's been 2 years now, right? They completely eliminated level of service. And so I think I'm simplifying it, but basically what happened was because we were looking at things, level of service, and many jurisdictions had said, well, we have to have this good level of service. Well, what's the solution? Build out the roadway. And that's how they took care of the problem. Well, that went against the values, and you may laugh that the state of California has values, but that was, we couldn't keep building our way out of the problem. We can't pay for this infrastructure, let alone maintain it. And so that was one large sweeping, there's a Senate Bill 743, they're still trying to figure out how they're going to deal with it, and it looks like it's going to be looking at VMT, they're going to manage vehicle miles traveled. Smaller scale and probably a lot closer to home is Chris and I are just wrapping up a project in the city of Fort Collins. And one of their community values is air quality. And so they said that, look, we need to start looking at what we're doing as a community, as a city, when we're planning for these projects and perhaps infrastructure improvements or new roadways or enhanced transportation corridors. What are we doing? We're not even checking ourselves to make sure that we're helping the air quality or making these investments sustainable. So we just developed an air quality tool, which basically we looked at the different projects that the city now has this tool that they can input. Okay, if we're going to do this project, what does this do to our air quality? Is it helping or is it making it worse? And so that was really important to them, and they made the investment to do that, and now they will continue looking at every project that they implement and see what the effect is. So.
Great, thank you. You've waited patiently. Please take advantage of these two wonderful experts. Ask your questions. I will ask you to make it a question. In fact, if you're not asking a question, I'll probably interrupt you. But let's start with Jackie. Yes, Jackie. And there's a microphone, so if you'll just wait a second, we'll get a microphone to you.
You know, one of the things I've been sort of following some of this. I've been living here for over 40 years. One of the things that I find commonly that very troubles me is you're talking about Seattle, you're talking about Los Angeles, you are not talking about a resort city. This is a resort community. Aspen has 6,000 people living in it. However, during our peak winter and summer seasons, we have maybe 25,000, 30,000 people. Those people all have different needs. In the summer, part of the reason we feel there's a lot more traffic is because a lot of our guests come by car because they come and stay 1 or 2 days. In the winter, a lot of our guests come by air. Now, when they come by air, we don't have Uber. They want Uber, but that's not going to work here. Our taxis and our shuttles work far better because we can put 10 or 15 people on a shuttle to the Gant or the Stonebridge or the Weston, whereas we put one family of 2 people in a
So,
taxi
Jackie,
or an
what
Uber.
is your question?
My question is, I'm very interested in what you've done in Park City, because that's the closest thing I've heard in the last several of these things is closest to the Aspen experience.
Okay. So applicability of all the things you talk about to a small resort community like Aspen is the question.
Right, and that's a great point. And to clarify, we do actually quite a bit of work in resort towns, and I think we tried to focus on what's the new technology and how it might impact and the effects of that. So Park City, again, it was very similar to what we did here in Aspen and TDM, and we did look at the visitors and tourists and how could we capture them so they didn't have to drive, and try to just implement ways that if they did drive here, if they drove from Colorado, neighboring states, that once they did park their car, they didn't need it again. So they could park once and then be able to have mobility choices to get around the city of Aspen. That was it was very important to the city, and the marketing piece with all the resorts and the places that these people were coming to stay. Really focusing on that. Just park once, and then we have all these options for you to get around. Same thing with Park City. They're a little more spread out, and it was a little more challenging to address the tourists. But they have shuttle buses. What people were said the reason they weren't taking them was they weren't as quick as some of these on-demand services. So yes, you could call a shuttle, but oftentimes it ran somewhat of a fixed route to get to them. And so it took a lot longer. This is where the TNCs come in, and they can be here in 2-4 minutes and get them exactly where they want to go. We've done a lot of resort work in the Tahoe area. But again, the key to the Park City piece was focusing on the employers and what could the employers do, because they would have the largest impact. They also have a lot of visitors to Park City. That roadway is congested. They have more than one entrance, but it's congested on a high ski day, very congested. But a lot of that congestion was caused by the people trying to get in there to get to their jobs.
Let's go to Jim Markolunas. I know you've been waiting over there, and
yes, my question is about 4 words, and it's why have we failed? And I elaborate on that question in this respect. We have a linear corridor from Glenwood Springs to Aspen. I served on the city council in late 90s. I was with John Bennett, and not to plagiarize Charles Dickens, we were a generation or a council of great expectations. But I feel we failed in the fact that we have not really had the willpower to go ahead and initiate light rail. We had a $40 million federal grant at one time for rail acquisition, and we didn't take advantage of it. So I guess my dilemma is that we had a wonderful opportunity and we didn't take advantage of it. And my question to you gentlemen and ladies is that do you see a solution to our problem of why we cannot implement light rail? We have a linear corridor and it would work. And we have a great bus system that hauls over 5 million passengers a year, and it's a great bus system, but it's not the best system. The best system is light rail. We see that in Denver. Denver, between the DIA and downtown Denver, it's a success.
so let's try this. This is a risky question. What do you think of light rail in our valley? There you go. I know there's people in the audience that would love to answer that, and you can't. But
I'll start that. So the rail infrastructure has some good things going for it. It's permanent. People know it's there. They know it's not likely to go away anytime soon. So thus, it can sort of incent investments to sort of make sure that the people will take advantage of that rail corridor. If rail were inexpensive and easily implemented, I don't see why it wouldn't be done in a lot more places. The fact of the matter is that I used to say that rail cost about $50 million a mile. I think the typical number these days is closer to between $75 and $100 million a mile to build a rail system. And there's different variants, but that's the chief issue with rail. And I think the cautionary note there is that rail works great if you can afford it and if you have the densities and the riders to support the ongoing maintenance costs of it. And in general, I see lots of areas, not the least to mention that the Airbart example, where rail gets put in with the best of intentions, but it doesn't quite work. And I know, Ann, you in the office have worked on like the Rail Runner in New Mexico, and that's struggled to really find its place. The buses still carry more people than that rail system does. So I think it would be a challenge, quite honestly.
Well, and I think it's also important to note that with the numbers that Chris was talking about and the ones I did on the Airbart, those are just the capital costs. It's not talking about the subsidized costs that are in addition to just building it. And I think the key is the density. You have to have, Denver is successful because where they chose to locate very dense areas where a lot of people are living and have access to utilize the system. If they don't use it, it fails, and it's a lot of money spent.
Peter Graney's next, all the way in the back.
We're primarily a real estate and resort economy, and we have a lot of construction workers and people working at resorts. Construction workers schlep tools, resort workers schlep skis and gear. And then we just don't have many desk jobs where people are commuting with a briefcase. And if they're working a desk job, they probably bring their dog. So what mobility service best accommodates people with tools, recreational gear, pets, or kids? And then my second question is the last form. The gentleman concluded by saying his solution to traffic is building more housing where people work, which kind of silenced the room, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Okay, so Peter got a twofer here, so take one and the other, and then the other one can answer the other question.
Is it time to silence the room yet?
Sure, go ahead, absolutely, if you want.
I think, yes, I think more affordable housing is important. What were the numbers we looked at? 8,000 workers coming in the city.
There's about 10,000.
10,000 and only 2,800
Correct.
Affordable units for them. That's a big difference. So yes, not to silence the room, but I think that's something that really needs to be looked at. You've done a great job. And I think overall, all the investments you've made have been very successful, and I don't say that lightly because I understand the congestion that you sit in, but I think if you had not made any of these investments, it'd be a lot worse. So you've done a lot of good stuff, and I think there's some ways to go, but I just want to compliment on what has been done. So yes, I think more affordable housing is very important, where people don't have to drive into the city. They're living in the city and they can walk.
Okay, now you get what's the best kind of mobility for construction workers, recreational people, and so forth?
So that's a great question because, and again, I have to default to sort of an urban answer, and I recognize those are not always satisfactory, but it's the urban areas that tend to sort of lead as to, okay, if you're building a large building in an urban area, there are not parking spaces for 3,000 construction workers at the building site. Impossible. They don't have that. How do they do that? They run remote lots and shuttle systems if you have a lot of gear that needs to be moved around, because again, not all the gear can be on the person. Some of it has to be there, but some of it you do have to carry in, and you're not carrying a toolbox that weighs 40 pounds on the bus. How it tends to be operated is through these shuttle systems, and where you're collecting folks at a remote lot where they can sort of manage that the congestion impacts in a more meaningful way. And I have to just add one twofer on the housing. I think housing's really important, but again, I go back to my point that if you add more housing in central Aspen, it is not necessarily going to solve the traffic problem. Housing's great. It sort of manages people's commute, but people move around, and you're still going to have traffic. And because that's part of what makes a city interesting. So don't expect that to eliminate traffic.
It's not the panacea. Yes, and then we'll go to another question.
I just want to add, also, transit adapts a little bit. I mean, how many years ago we didn't have bikes on buses, we didn't have, skis on buses. The A line, which is the line that runs from the DIA down to downtown Denver, those are specifically built to accommodate luggage and large people having a lot of luggage and families. So, transit adapts to those uses. But
Okay, the gentleman in the black and white top on the aisle there.
Is this on? Is it on? Yeah. Hi, my name's Jim Breasted. I say that because I haven't lived in Aspen for so long. I need to introduce myself. I served on the council under two different mayors. Under one mayor, we bought Ruby Park, and under the other mayor, we bought the Rio Grande property. Both transportation. Rio Grande, I like to tell people, was bought with transportation money. It wasn't bought as a memorial to a singer. And Ruby Park, can you imagine what it would be like to buy Ruby Park today? $500 million would be a giveaway. I was born in Colorado Springs in 1937. My mother never rode an airplane until 1951. So the point of my saying that is that we traveled by train. My grandparents lived in Chicago. We traveled by train everywhere. Nobody flew in those days. And my question to you is, I want to address your scope of work. We are served by Amtrak 41 miles from here. It was my great privilege to ride both east and west this last summer on Amtrak, and I would like to ask you whether Amtrak and the existence of that rail line is in your scope of work. I think it's a very important. I'm not at the treetop level. I'm at the ground level. I'm on the sidewalk level. And I think it's a wonderful service that we have in Glenwood Springs. So that's my appeal to you, is that as you go forward with this, that you keep that in mind. Glenwood has forgotten that it was built by two railroads. One of the railroad right-of-ways is now a road, and the other is still a railroad in a legal sense. I mean, every day there is a person moving into this valley that thinks that the Rio Grande right-of-way is a bikeway. It's not a bikeway. It's a railroad. It's been rail banked, and I beg people not to forget that.
Thanks, Jim. So comment on the connectivity, or lack thereof, between a major hub like an Amtrak, all 40 miles from here, and what that does or doesn't mean for our traffic. It's a tough question.
That is a tough question. The proximity to sort of regional connections, I think, is important, because if people choose to use Amtrak as a mode right now, it's likely that they would have to drive there. I think that making that connection on that is still likely to be generally governed by cars. Cars are going to be the a way to do that, because of the sort of tend to be moving luggage around, and the density of that type of a connection for something like a bus connection, to me, seems to be problematic. But that gets to the issue of, again, we're not, as transportation planners, we're not against cars, and in fact, vehicle connections can be the best connection in certain circumstances. So how can you make sure that there's space and capacity to make those connections that really aren't well served by other modes?
Okay. This next. Yes, sir, right here. Just, we'll get a microphone for you.
Oh, sorry. Is in all the different variables that you use to study a situation, and I don't know the proper terms, but is there a way to kind of qualify that there always has to be a certain amount of sort of, I don't know, tension in the congestion of things, so that people will use, because there seems to be plenty of capacity to use the buses that exist, whether it's in-town trips or down valleys. So, I mean, the amount of congestion we have right now, will that kind of almost always exist? And is that something we have to accept? Because, you know, the capacity is there. The days that I even choose to use it has to do with that there's greater congestion even than maybe this morning.
Sure, that's a great question. The term, I have a nerdy term for you that speaks to that. It's called equilibrium. So the short answer is yes. As people choose to make a travel choice, they're weighing a bunch of factors, and congestion and the frustration caused by that is one of the things that people need to make a decision. So, you know, day to day, there's variation, which can lead to a lot of frustration, but over time, if someone gets frustrated with a mode, they will tend to shift. And it goes all ways. If the bus is too slow and there's less congestion, what are they going to do? They're going to flip over and start driving some more. And what does that do? It adds back to the congestion. So when we look at a lot of communities, the amount, once they kind of reach a critical level of congestion, the amount of congestion doesn't really change. The number of vehicle trips stays flat for decades, even in growing communities. We see this all over the country because there's a certain amount of tolerance that people have. You can drive around all you want at 2 in the morning, but people don't want to do that. There's plenty of capacity at certain times of the day. So there's these travel behavior sort of sets that say, here's about how much congestion is tolerable, and that's part of why I say you can't necessarily get rid of congestion, because as the level goes down, people say, hey, it's more convenient for me to make that auto trip, so I'm going to make that auto trip now because it's not so frustrating. So the term's called latent demand, and that's something that we're always working against, and so that's why congestion is really almost an insolvable problem.
So there you go. If we take all the cars off our road, it'll go back up because people see the roads available and the latent demand fills in what we left. Thanks a lot. No, seriously, I know it's an important concept. Yes, Skippy, and then we'll come to the back as well, and Mick will be numbered.
Thank you guys so much for coming and sharing with us. Appreciate it. It seems to me that if you were to give people two options, sitting in traffic in their car by themselves and kind of a coffee shop experience where you could answer emails, do work, get a cup of coffee, there are very few people that would choose the former. We have a traffic problem, oftentimes an hour getting into or out of our town, and it seems to me that creating a mass transit system with the environment that reflects more of a coffee shop is not a technological issue, whether it is based on rails or wheels, individualized or mass. We could create that environment. The choice of what you would do would be costing, land use, etc. The problem, it seems, is a psychosocially derived behavioral problem, right? We associate the car with things that we like: freedom, aspiration, success, and we don't have those associations, in many cases the opposite association, with mass transit. So how do we, or what communities have you seen that have effectively made that transition, and how did they break down those behavioral barriers?
So it's an interesting question, because our previous speaker said you can't change behavior, and here we're talking about changing behavior. So respond to that. What do you find effective in changing behavior, if anything?
That, to get people out of their comfort to sit in a shared vehicle. Some people don't have a problem with it. A lot of people do. Call it stranger danger or whatever. I don't think there's some people you're not going to change that behavior for. But I think a lot of things like increased congestion or incentives or disincentives, where it's not that uncomfortable to have the alternative. I don't feel like I'm answering that very well.
So just one thought on that. I think rather than I think the private sector has done more than the public sector could ever hope to on addressing that issue, and it's in what's in most people's pockets. I don't know where I put mine. Oh yeah, here it is. So it's this thing that has shifted a lot of people's perception as to what, how can I get more value out of things. So I think that sort of trend is likely to continue to take place. But what can the public sector do? And it's always a question of of dollars. Because why do people like trains better than buses? Trains are bigger than buses. You don't tend to be as cramped up, especially things like commuter rail, where you sometimes can get tables and stuff. It's a nicer ride. Costs a lot more to do that. So public sector always has to balance that, the cost versus the convenience. But I think a lot of transit agencies are making it easier for people to use the devices that they know help encourage people to make that more worthwhile to do. So I think there's some opportunities to partner with telecommunications companies, or just bring in some technologies onto transit vehicles, or to make easier to find, like, where's the bike share station? Well, make it easy
to compute that. I know you could sit down with your ArcView and do this. Given enough time, you could say what were the minimal routes for all these people who wanted to do this. So, but could you do something in real time? Is there enough power to do
brief answers, because I'm getting this wave back there. 0 minutes. We're out of time. 7 o'clock, because it gets cut off. But
I'll have
we're going to go on.
Very short follow-up, but very short.
Okay.
Very, very briefly, that research has been around since about the 60s about how to do that. The technology is just coming online to do just that. And again, the transportation network companies through Uber Pool and Lyft Line are doing the sort of, with not computer driven, but a human driven, but computer routed, computer dispatched version of that right now. So that's coming. The one thing I would note is that there's limitations to that. Transit, in my opinion, is not going away, because even with that setup, you can't necessarily replace the trunk sort of capacity of transit vehicles. So I think just the night bus is coming pretty quick. You don't have to have a magic wand to call it one pretty soon. So I think that's coming soon.
The night bus. It sounds like a B movie. Real quick, then we're going to George.
I'll be really quick about this. I'm not visualizing this as replacing all of our fixed routes, but the people who live, 4 blocks from a fixed route and aren't likely to walk up the hill carrying their groceries. And well, that's all I have to say. But thanks.
All right, George. I think we're getting toward the end. The end of the end. George.
So right now we've got people that will hop on a bus down valley. They either walk or drive to that bus station. They get on a bus and they come all the way to wherever they're going. They get off the bus, and from there they'll walk or they'll get on a wheat cycle. One of the ideas we're looking at is capturing people at the intercept lot, which is 6 miles outside of town, using the BRT, going to the intercept lot, and then from there having to transfer to a local system. So my question is, what sort of resistance factor do you see or anticipate when people have to change their modes and get from one bus, wait, and get onto another bus versus just taking their car and going on in?
Multimodal. Comments?
Just real quick, that what's called the transfer penalty is not insignificant. People do not like to transfer modes. However, you can overcome that to a degree by, are the transfers timed? Are they reliably timed? Or is the frequency so high that you don't mind that wait? So that's how you overcome that. But that's where that congestion piece is important. If there's not a congestion penalty, people aren't going to, or a price to park or something, it's just easier and faster to drive. They're going to drive. They're not going to do that transfer.
And this probably should be it, because we can talk afterwards, but we got to bring this to an end. Go ahead, Ann. You want to respond to that? Okay. All right, I think we owe them a great deal of thanks for their expertise. Thank you all for coming, and please come on up if you had additional questions we weren't able to get to.